My name is Jeremy Spohr. I'm the Assistant Director of ISSS. A lot of you have heard of these things, and we're not going to go into great detail, but I just want to touch on it a little bit. For most of you who are F1 students, the main types of work permission that you have in the U.S. are CPT or OPT. CPT is curricular practical training, meaning that has to do with the curriculum of what you are studying, and you need to have a class that goes with it. OPT is optional practical training, and that just means it's optional. There is no class that goes with it. You can see the timeline for those, and there are differences between them. And there's lots of information on the ISSS website, much more specific details about each one of these things. But these are the main F1 work permission options that you have for most all of our international students at Penn. One of the big differences I want to highlight is the processing time. So CPT is curricular, so that's handled by the school. That's handled by your school at Penn, could be, C's or Wharton or GSE and ISSS. So we can process that very quickly. Whereas OPT, you have to send your application to the Immigration Service, and that takes a few months to process. Most of them this fall have been coming back anywhere between 2 to 3 months. So they've been a little faster now that USCIS has an online application. It's a little faster. OPT is a great option. And for either of them, you must certainly have the authorization in your hand, and the start date you have to be at the start date before you can start to engage in any employment. There's a little timeline for OPT. If you are a December grad, if you're graduating in 23 days from now, you want to apply for OPT now, for post-completion OPT. It is the time. You should apply immediately if you have not, and you're graduating in December. A lot of you may be STEM eligible. If you have a certain degree that's science, technology, engineering, or math, you can apply for the STEM extension towards the end of your regular OPT period. And there's lots of information on our website about STEM and what majors are STEM, etc. And there may be a lot of you here who are May graduates, and that means that the OPT period, application period, will open up 90 days before graduation. Spring graduates will apply in the end of February. So think 90 days back from graduation is February 15th. So that's when the spring OPT season will open up. Make sure you connect with your ISSS advisor, outside of this presentation, and we can help you out. And we have appointments 5 days a week, so you can find one of us to talk to via the ISSS website.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Jackie Mornier, one of the advisors in Career Services. I specifically work with undergrad and graduate students in School of Engineering and Applied Science. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about self-assessment and job exploration, or more career exploration, in a broad sense. So, and also kind of sort of position of why this is important, where this fits in the whole sort of process that we're going through today. And so self-assessment is a part of career exploration or job exploration, right? So essentially reflecting on and evaluating where your strengths are, where your interests are, and where your preferences are. It's really important to think about it, not just because reflecting on those things and thinking about those things are important for career satisfaction, but also for practical reasons, such as knowing what your work authorization options are, or where do you see yourself, where do you want to be location-wise, long-term or short-term? Because those are things you're going to want to consider earlier rather than later as you're thinking about your career. Just like Jeremy mentioned about, depending on your visa status, you will have to make sure you're pursuing an opportunity that's related to your major, right? So this is why participating and engaging in sort of self-assessment and career exploration is important. I also want to make it clear that these processes that we're talking about in this presentation today, they happen, you're going to be going through these throughout your entire life, right? So it's not like I have to do this first, and then I have to do this first, and I have to, you're going to be engaging in these activities in different parts of your experience, and even revisiting them as you go through the process. So what's also great about thinking about and sort of writing down and knowing sort of yourself, right? What are your skills and accomplishments and values, is because that's something you're also going to be communicating to employers or while you're networking, right? So I always say doing that pre-work in terms of before you're even engaging in that process, having your value proposition ready. So what is your value proposition? What can I contribute? What are my skills? What are my accomplishments relevant to the opportunities I'm pursuing? Because you're going to be communicating that, whether it's on your brand for your LinkedIn profile, whether it's in a cover letter or a resume, whether it's just in an interview or just networking, a coffee chat with an employer. So it's really important to think about these things before you even get started on your search, or making sure that you, before you're sitting in an interview, you have to think about, oh, what can I contribute? What are my accomplishments? Career exploration in general is really just what you're doing, process of researching, evaluating, and learning about work opportunities, gaining insights into potential careers. What are the skills necessary for a particular career? So in terms of self-assessment tools, there are a variety of different options. Career Explorer is the one that I want to highlight and talk about. Career Explorer is a free resource. And what I love about it is there's the assessment piece, right? So it asks you really awesome questions about things that you like and don't like, what you're interested in. And then at the end, it kind of gives you sort of this high level overview of what you, based on other folks who are happy in their fields and their industry, what areas you might find interesting. I want to make it clear when doing any sort of assessment that it's not telling you what you should do, but it is definitely a tool to help you think about and contemplate some areas of interest. Outside of the assessment piece, they actually have just that careers option where you can explore. I think they have over 1,000 different career areas that you can explore and get more information in. They also have a community area where you can join a Discord channel to communicate with other folks who may be interested in similar things. So Career Explorer is a really awesome tool. In one of the tools in the sort of self-assessment, what kind of things, if I'm not really sure what I want to do, what am I interested in? But also I can explore these careers as well. So highly recommend this tool. Moving on to exploration resources in general, I do think it's important to break, this is just sort of one framework to break down exploration into research, networking, and experiential learning. So getting that hands-on experience. So part of exploring includes just doing research, right? Understanding what's sort of out there, looking at outcomes data from your major, joining, I'll talk more about this, but joining industry communities. So on our website, there is, if you log in, you'll be able to choose either affinity group or an industry group, and you'll actually get newsletters with opportunities and blog posts related to those industries. A website I really like is whatcanidowiththismajor.com. And it has some examples of, if you're interested in electrical engineering or computer science, here are some options that you can think about. Research, and then also networking. So engaging with alumni, upperclassmen, peers, faculty, trying to get a sense of what others' journeys are, talking to other international students about what did you do in this situation, right? So networking is an important part of this process. And then of course, actually getting the hands-on experience. And then going back to sort of that self-assessment piece, you're going to see that your values and your interests, all those are going to kind of change as you get more hands-on experience, as you research, as you talk to people, and your experiential sort of learning opportunities, whatever they may be, you might think that I don't like doing this. And that's just as important as figuring out what you do like to do, right? So I'm going to going forward, I want to talk about each section. So exploration through research. On our website, we have outcomes data. You'll actually be able to see what particular majors or summer opportunities or post-grad opportunities, what have folks in these particular majors gone on to do? There's also another website called Vault Guide. So it was just recently bought by Firsthand, but Vault is essentially a career intelligence site where they produce these massive guides, just information where professionals in the industries actually, guide the information in these guides. And they basically give you, how do you get your foot in the door? What are some tips for entry? What are some resources? Here's some different titles associated with this major for your search. So Vault is also a really good resource. And then exploration through networking. So 2 tools I want to just lift up here. It's Penn, which is our alumni directory. I will say for Penn, I don't use as much as LinkedIn, and I'll explain why, but for Penn, there is a mentorship option. So when you filter for industry, major, whatever you want to filter for, if you check that mentorship box, you're going to see folks come up that have indicated, self-selected, that they want to be a mentor. So that's another good option. So I personally use LinkedIn more for finding alumni, scheduling information, interviews with alumni to learn more about their industry, to see where students and alumni go for internships or full-time. And so if you go to University of Pennsylvania's LinkedIn profile, you're going to see that alumni tab there. You click on that, and then you can actually do some filtering there, whether you want to use keywords or filter by your major or location, and kind of get a sense of where. So I use it for a couple of reasons. One, just to see where alumni are working. So even if it's not for networking, I might say, okay, well, I'm interested in computer science, and I see this as senior software developer at what, right? And so I'll look at their profiles so that I can see where they might have interned, where they're currently working, et cetera. And I might create a list of some other organizations or startups that I might be interested in, and then research that. After that, then I might say, okay, this is a really cool opportunity. I didn't know about Argo AI in Pittsburgh. It's a great self-driving, software company, and this is really interesting. So I want to then reach out to that alum that I found on LinkedIn and get some more information. So I really like using this for networking. Another one is CareerShift. CareerShift is a database, is a great database, but it also has a really cool, if you search for contacts, it tries to pull in, since it's a web scraper, so it pulls in any live URL. Or any information from a live URL. So that means that outside of LinkedIn, sometimes you could actually find direct contact information for folks on CareerShift, since it's looking through the entire web for information. So CareerShift can also be great for finding folks who are working in an organization that you're interested in. And the same for Handshake too, in terms of recruiters. So these are a couple options for networking. And then exploration through experiential learning. So that's just a hands-on experience, right? So this is just a screenshot of Handshake, which is our centralized sort of job internship opportunity database. It's is not the only one that you should be using, but it's really great because you know that whatever opportunity you see there, University Penn was selected as, this organization wants to post this opportunity at Penn. So Handshake is a great option, not only just for the opportunities, but also for the events or on-campus interviewing and all this other stuff that happens on Handshake. So it's a great one-stop shop for a lot of things, a lot of information. But there's other things like, Idealist and LinkedIn. And so there's other databases, right? But then there's also thinking about experiential learning outside of just a full-time internship. So what about, classroom projects? What about hands-on experience in the club, working with alumni. And so that all ties into going back to reflecting and self-assessment of like, okay, well, I had this experience, and, so all of these things are really important as you go through the process. In terms of figuring out where to find these, all of this is right on our career services website. If you go to learn how to explore careers and industries, you're going to see these links that I shared today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marianne Lippa. I'm one of the advisors on the graduate student and postdoc team, and I'm going to talk to you today about resumes and cover letters. So one of the things to think about as you create your resume is, what kind of impression do you want to leave with the recruiter who's reviewing it? So if they're looking at your resume for about 10 seconds, what would be the information and the impression that you would like to make for them? And so that's kind of serving as the framework for what our suggestions are as it comes to creating your resume. So in terms of general tips and formatting, we recommend 1 page for undergraduate students, and we recommend 1 to 2 pages for graduate students. So it's really important that that's the general expectation, depending on which degree level you are at. We want to make sure that it's as readable as possible for the reviewer. Keep in mind that this is going to be the first time they're looking at the document, so you want to make sure that the font size is not too small, that the margins are not too narrow. So you really want to keep that readability factor in mind as you create the document. You also want to make sure that you are consistent with your formatting. Making sure that the font is consistent. So whichever font style you decide to use is going to be important, that it's used throughout and that you're not changing from one style to another. You want to make sure that there are not any like distracting graphics on there or logos or anything like that. You want to make this as straightforward as possible with the formatting. You also want to make sure that in terms of the usage of the space on the paper, right, that you have enough width in your margins. So you don't want it to be so densely written and difficult for the reviewer to actually follow what's on the resume itself. When there's too much information, it's too dense, it's going to be difficult for them to really look through that information. In terms of the font size itself, we really recommend that you not have it be less than 10 for the size. 10 point type is really what we're aiming for as the smallest. So if you can use 11, that's great. 11.5 or 12, but you definitely don't want to be smaller than 10. It just becomes very unreadable and it's just way too small. You also want to make sure that whichever style font you are going to be using for your resume, that it's also the same one you're using for your cover letter. That's also very important, that you're not switching between one font style and another. In terms of making sure that you have enough white space on the paper and making sure that your margins are not too narrow, we recommend that they not be smaller than 1/2 inch. So that would be the absolute smallest. If you can make that larger, that would be ideal. But again, the minimum should not be below 1/2 inch. As you think about how to present the information, how to write the information on the resume, you want to think about a couple of things. The first being that you want this to be very much action-based, right? As you describe your skills, your responsibilities, the projects that you've worked on, and how you've had an impact, the results are beneficial, or what the results might be. So thinking about it kind of not just from what you did, but also like, what did you accomplish? What were the goals? What were the objectives? So one of the ways to do that is to make sure that in the information you provide, you're using good action verbs. So we've compiled a list on our website, and there's a link that's going to be shared in the resources after the presentation, that really kind of capture what are some good action verbs to include on the resume itself. So some of the words might be administered, coordinated, evaluated, supervised. These are very specific in nature, right? And that's going to be important because you don't want to just describe something in a general term, such as I assisted or I worked for. You want to make sure that these are much more clear in terms of what your responsibility was and what you did in terms of that project. Another great way to think about these verbs is thinking about, okay, did you coordinate with others? Did you train? Did you advise? Did you consult? Those, again, are very action-based. You also want to make sure that you're using proper tenses. So if the project is still ongoing, or if your role is still ongoing, if you have a summer internship and you're in the process of applying for a position and it has not yet been completed, then you can use present tense. If in fact the project or responsibility has ended, then you would be using past tense. So just be mindful of which tense is appropriate based on what that particular task or responsibility or project would be. You also want to keep in mind that the resume is not intended to be written in complete sentences. So, it's going to be a much more summarized format. It's going to be kind of including those key highlights. And so as a result, you're not going to be using first person, such as I or my or mine. You're going to be using much more of kind of that action summarized statement. You also don't need to be using articles such as a, an, or the. They really don't need to be included because, again, you're not using complete sentences. You're just using a very summarized descriptive line. You also want to think about, in the details and context that you're providing to the reader, what are some of the results, or what was the outcome or the impact that you had, right? And if you're able to quantify that information, that is going to be really helpful for them. It gives a little bit more depth, a little bit more scope, and a more kind of dimension to the facts and details that you are including on the resume. So just to kind of summarize, it's using a good, strong action verb, thinking about the details and context. If you're able to quantify, that would be incredibly helpful for the reader to understand that a little bit better. And then lastly, thinking about what is the result, what is the impact, what is the outcome. So as you kind of go through the document, kind of from the top to the bottom, one of the things that's going to be important to do is to include your contact information. We've included some sample excerpts from resumes on here that I think would be helpful just to kind of see it visually as you go to create your resume. So on this particular slide, you'll see an example of how to present the information with your name, address, email, and phone number. It's also becoming very common to see is that somebody may decide to just list their name, their phone number, email, and then their location, which would be Philadelphia, PA. So it's really what you feel comfortable with. Some people want to include their actual street address and some people don't. It's really up to you. Keep in mind that, again, you want to make sure that it's not too overwhelmingly large at the top of your resume. So again, your name can be slightly larger, but you don't want it to be, 3 times the size of the rest of the information that you have on the resume itself. So just some aesthetic details to keep in mind. Then after you have your contact information, the next section that you'll want to have written on the resume would be your education. Under the education, you would be listing your current program, which is your current institution. So for those of you who are graduate students, this would be your graduate level program. For those of you that are undergraduates, it would be your undergraduate institution and program. So here you'll see that, this is for a graduate level students. So they've listed the University of Pennsylvania, specifically then the school that they are enrolled in, the city and state, and then which master's program it is. And it's very important to also include when you expect to finish. They don't need to necessarily have the start date of the program and the end date, but what's important is when do you plan to complete the degree? So you would say expected May 2022, or whichever year that would be for you. You can also list some honors that you may have received or are receiving as part of your program. That is certainly appropriate to list as well. In the example below, you'll see that there is also kind of the option for those that maybe have been enrolled in, they finished their undergraduate degree and now they're enrolled in what we call an accelerated second degree. And so this is how, this is an example of how you'd be able to phrase it on the resume. You would be listing the most current program, which is the accelerated second degree, when that's expected to finish. Some students elect to put their GPA on here. Certainly that is something that you are able to do if you'd like. It's more common at the undergraduate level versus the graduate level. So that is something to keep in mind as well, that there are going to be some nuances that are slightly different depending on your degree level. Underneath of the current program at Penn would then be the undergraduate institution that they also attended. Then after the education section, you'll have what we consider your experience section. So the professional work experience that you have. You want to keep in mind that you're going to be putting either the most relevant experience and position that you've had first, and then kind of going downward on the page with other positions that you've had. So for example, if let's say under your experience section, you are currently conducting research. So you may decide to title this section research experience as opposed to professional experience. So there's different ways that you can title the experience section, and you can certainly work with an advisor on trying to help understand what might be the best way to kind of capture that experience in terms of the title. But for example, you can absolutely list, under your relevant experience, if you have a research role, for example, you would then have your bullet points following that using good action verbs, giving good details and context for the reader, and then thinking about, okay, what was the result of this research? Did it result in a publication? Did you have a presentation? What were some of the goals of the research? If they're known at that point, sometimes you're not yet at that stage in that research. You also want to think about what are some of the ways that you would be able to list it in a very kind of concise and streamlined way, right? So you want to make sure that this is presented in a clear manner for the reader, because again, this is the first time they're looking at it. So it's really important to think about how can I very clearly express what it is that I have been doing. So if, for example, some of the highlights of that research are noteworthy or significant, or if there was a particular area of that research that you are specifically involved in, that was a significant accomplishment, significant result, that again is going to be something to include as well. Now, within the experience section, of course, there's going to be lots of different things that you may have had as part of your experience. So you might have had the professional experience, perhaps research experience, perhaps you have additional experience that's important to include, and that can be in a separate section, right? So you don't necessarily need to have the experience be all kind of a one catch-all section. It can have different experience sections where you then list additional experience. That's going to be one way that I think keeps it in a very clear and organized manner. In addition to professional experience, you may also want to talk about any volunteer experience you've had, any leadership experience you've had. So that would be another section that you can certainly include as well. So here's a sample, I think, that just kind of shows the different ways that you can present the information. And so in this sample, we've chosen to show how you can talk about relevant experience. So if this particular position and career field that the applicant is applying to is going to really kind of emphasize certain experiences and certain positions that are necessary for this particular role, it is helpful to maybe have a section that says relevant experience, so that it basically streamlines it and summarizes it in a much more clear way. The reviewer is able to see, okay, these are the positions in the applicant's background that are most relevant and most directly correlate to the position they're applying for. So as a result, you'll see the relevant experience. You'll see 3 positions that are listed underneath of that. You'll then see that there's a second section included that talks about additional experience. So again, you don't have to necessarily put it all into one large section. You can have kind of the separate experience sections as well. In terms of leadership and volunteer experience, this is certainly something that you can include on the resume. We recommend that you do, because it shows what your skills are outside of just the professional realm, and that you're also cultivating the skill set in other opportunities and other ways, whether that's through extracurricular involvement, through volunteer work, any leadership roles that you might have. So for example, in the slide here, you'll see that this particular student had some leadership roles as a representative in their alumni association. They also had some experience working as a student missions ambassador, and then also as a facilitator in the Spanish cultural chat on campus. So again, these are different ways to think about, okay, how have I been able to cultivate my skill set in other ways? And I'd like to share that information on the resume. In the second sample, you'll see that, instead of just listing it, which doesn't really say much, right? Because the reviewer is going to think, well, what does the facilitator, what did they do? What did they mean? What did the young alumni representative entail? What did somebody do as an admissions ambassador? You'll see that providing those details and context are so important, right? This is a much more kind of robust explanation for what it is that they've done. And so you can see that it's not just listing the information, it's actually diving more into the specifics, making it much more action-based, thinking about what it is that might have been the goals, what were some of the various projects or responsibilities that they had. So you'll see that they're using a good action verb in those bullet points. They're providing some details about what that role required of them, what they did as part of that role. And so again, you want to think about ways that you can quantify the information. So for example, under the Alumni Schools Committee position, that particular experience as a co-chair allowed them to manage over 300 alumni volunteers. If they had just written and said manage New York area alumni volunteers, assigning interviews and college fair requests, it says information that the reader can certainly follow, but by saying about how many that actually included, it just gives much more understanding and much more information and context to kind of the scale of this particular role. So again, it's not just using a good action verb, but it's also being able to provide those details to the reader, which quantifying information is one of the best ways to do that. Now, and in another section that you would want to think about including on the resume, and we recommend doing so, is any additional information that would be important for the reviewer to understand and to know what it is that you have in your background and your skill set. So this particular section we call additional information. This can include any language skills you might have, any specific technical skills that you have in your background, or through coursework, any certifications that might be relevant or noteworthy to include. And then if you have the space and there's room to still include this part, you can also have interests and hobbies. It just shows, who you are outside of school, what are some of the interests that you might have. So an example of this would be, in this particular excerpt, we have the student has selected languages to include, and so they're talking about what their language skills are, and then any particular interests that they have that focus on music and dance. So shifting now to cover letters, which are often required, though more and more companies are saying that they are optional or not required. However, it's important to think about, if you are going to be submitting a cover letter with your application, what are the ways to help frame that explanation that you're going to provide in the cover letter? What is it going to be describing in terms of your narrative, your background? And so similar to how we thought about what would you want the recruiter and the reviewer of your resume to know about you and what kind of impression? Well, after reading a cover letter, you want to think about what is the impression you're going to give them? How would they want to remember you as? And we often will say, well, think about it as this candidate is, and then fill in the blank, right? So thinking about how are you going to want to complete this sentence? And how are you going to want to make sure you're conveying your interest in the position, your qualifications? It's all really important as you start to kind of craft and outline that cover letter. So thinking about what are the different elements of the cover letter, it's really answering three main questions, which is why you're interested in this position and why you're interested in this company. How are you qualified based on your skill set, your academic program, your background, your experiences, and how are you qualified in additional ways? So thinking about the first question, why you're interested. So this really serves as probably the most fundamental aspect of your narrative, right? So you're explaining why you're interested in the role, why you're interested in this particular company or organization. So it's going to be important to make sure it's very clear which position you're applying for in that introductory paragraph, and why you're also interested in this particular company, organization. It's not just about the position, but also at a larger level, why you're interested in working for them. So you also want to think about, if, let's say, this cover letter is not in response to the specific position or job posting that you've seen, you can write a more general letter of interest with your application that just simply indicates and conveys your interest, but you're also showing that you do have some flexibility, right? Because the cover letter normally would be in response to a specific job posting, and then you're able to provide your examples as to why you're qualified and why you're interested. That being said, sometimes, a company may not have a job posting, but you're maybe interested in having a summer internship there, or, just being able to kind of convey your interest. And so that's another option as well. But if it is in response to a specific job opportunity or internship opportunity, you really want to make sure that you're conveying it in the context as a response to the position itself. So as you start to gather your thoughts to start writing the letter, there's a few key points that you really want to reflect on and keep in mind as you start to draft the cover letter. And that would be the mission statement, perhaps of the company, right? So doing some research on who they are, what is kind of their overall mission, how do they describe themselves, what are some of the values that are mentioned. You can also check recent media presence, so anything in the news, any projects, any initiatives that have been mentioned. Social media is another good way to learn more about that particular organization and company. You also want to think about, are there any specialties as it comes to their particular area of research? Is there something that really makes them kind of unique in their particular industry that is important to talk about? If you've had, let's say, a conversation with perhaps a recruiter from the company, or somebody there and they've given you a referral, You can certainly include that as well. And then similarly, if you've had any previous experience with the company, so thinking about, is there any kind of interaction you've had with a representative from the organization, or perhaps, you've previously had an internship there and now you're thinking about a full-time position. So again, thinking about, is there any kind of interaction that you've had that you can also talk about. So in terms of how you're qualified, this is going to be, kind of the middle section of the cover letter, and it's an opportunity for you to highlight your relevant experience, your relevant skills as it relates to the position and what would be the job responsibilities. So you want to think about how you are able to demonstrate that you've had this either in your background, in your experience, based on what's listed in that job posting, in that job description. So unfortunately, you can't list all of the experiences that you bring in response to that job posting. You will need to select one or two that are most related. And those are going to be your examples that you would then talk about in the cover letter. You also want to think about how you can describe, what your accomplishments have been, what your results have been, what the impact has been, because again, it's not just talking about, you've had experience with a particular skill or research or project, but it's also about what you've done as part of that specifically. What did you accomplish and what was your impact? The next thing you want to consider as you write your cover letter is how you're qualified in additional ways, in other ways. So thinking about how you're going to be able to leverage some of your complementary skill sets. So, outside of, professional positions or, any kind of academic projects that you've had, thinking about what are some of the leadership roles or experience you've had, any volunteer work, any community involvement, any research experience that's relevant, any international experience that's relevant, and any prior work experience that you may want to talk about as well in your cover letter. And in terms of next steps, in the conclusion, we always recommend that you thank them for their time and their consideration of your application. That's always, certainly nice to end the letter with that. And also you want to indicate, your availability for either an interview, for the interview to talk about how you are interested, what your qualifications are in a further context, right? Because certainly the resume and cover letter are means for you to be able to express that, but an interview can certainly allow you to speak about that even further. And then finally, you also want to make sure that you provide your contact information, so your phone number and email address.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Chambers, and I'm another associate director within Career Services. I support Wharton undergraduate students and alumni specifically. And for my part of the presentation today, we are going to dive a little bit deeper into networking. I know Jackie gave a really great overview of how networking can factor into the career exploration process. So now we're just going to dive even deeper into more of the specifics. So to get started, I think it's really important to first think about what networking is. A lot of times when you hear that word networking, it seems broad, it seems a little scary, maybe a little vague. So before we think about how we can utilize it, let's define what that is. So first off, networking is thinking and talking with a clear goal in your mind. What are you hoping will be the outcome of your networking efforts? Generally, networking tends to be 50% information gathering, with the other half being information sharing. So you're going out and connecting with someone to learn more about maybe their path in an industry, how they leverage their skills at Penn to be successful in a certain role. And in addition, you're allowing that person to get to know you. What are you interested in? What skills do you have, and how might you want to apply them after graduation? The tricky thing with networking is that it's never done, and it's something that you will always be working on as a general skill. You'll never be perfect at it or have it under your belt ready to go. It is a skill that will continuously be worked on, and the more you, just like when you're exercising, the more you work that muscle, the stronger it'll be. So I just want to take a moment to clarify what that is. And now we're going to look really quickly about what networking is not, because that's another important part of our networking conversation. So networking is not a way to get a referral for a job absolute. Sometimes, yes, you might reach out and talk with someone, whether it's an alumni or a non-Penn contact. You have a really great conversation. And sometimes, yeah, that might lead to, would you be able to send me a resume? I'd love to pass that along to someone. However, that is rare, and that should not be your goal going into these conversations. As I mentioned earlier, your goal is information seeking and information gathering, as well as information sharing. Something else that's important to keep in mind about networking, it is not just a one-time conversation. A large part of networking is maintaining those relationships over time so you can continue to build that network, and also so that you can continue to build your skills and your knowledge of whatever industry or role you're interested in. And finally, networking is not something that people have to do for you. It's very helpful when someone who's working in industry or role would like to connect with you or help you out. Most people are, but it's not something that's required of anyone. So that's also something to keep in mind when you begin your outreach process here. So one of the, I guess, main parts of networking that I know our office talks a lot about is this idea of an informational interview. And I actually like to think about these more as an informational meeting, because in my brain, informational interview kind of makes me think like I'm interviewing for a job, which is what I just said, not what your goal of networking should be. So I like to think these as informational meetings. Again, it's just one type of networking, but it tends to be one that can be the easiest to kind of get started or get the ball rolling and begin to practice those skills. And what it essentially is you connecting with either a Penn alumni or non-Penn contact and asking them questions about their industry, their role, their experience, their opinions, and allows you to not only connect with them, but potentially have the opportunity to connect with others in their field. Maybe you talk to someone and they maybe don't have an answer to a specific question about a particular role in whatever industry they're in. They might be able to refer you to someone else that you can talk to get those questions answered. So I just want to point that out, that it is a very common type of networking. And I know that a lot of times our office does help students navigate those conversations. Thinking about informational interviews and networking, as I even mentioned, the first part of our brain probably goes to networking. I think alumni, I think people who are already working. But it's also important to take a pause and think about networking within the community you've built for yourself at Penn, whether that's peers that are in a group project with you in a class. If you're an underclassman, potentially upperclassmen, you might be able to talk to or connect with through any extracurriculars or organizations you're involved in. Maybe a professor's class you really liked or enjoyed the subject matter on. Any mentors you might have on campus, as well as going back to your community at home and seeing if anyone might have any advice or know a friend who navigated that industry. It's also important to not discount the community that you already have and try to start there when you think about how can I utilize my resources in my community to potentially begin this process. So, and then this leads into the next question of how can I expand that community? How can I go beyond the community I've built at Penn, the community I've built back home? And a kind of almost logical next step is to connect with one of our Penn alumni. The easiest way to do that is via My Penn, formerly known as QuakerNet. You would log in with your Penn key. And what's really great about this tool is it'll give you access to a directory that allows you to search Penn alumni through industry, role. I mean, you can search filters all the way down to college house, other organizations they may have been involved in on campus. There's a lot of information here. So once you log on to that My Penn page with your Penn key, you can see here at the top, you would click directory, and that would take you to those filters and the search feature that I mentioned earlier. This is a really great way if you want to connect with someone in a particular industry that's also a Penn alumni. This is a great way to just get that conversation started. And now I'm going to take you through a little bit more specifically the parts of the directory that could be helpful for you when you begin thinking about outreaching. So as I said, you can search by so many filters using this, but one I think is particularly useful is the filter that says available for mentorship. This means that this alumni basically checked a box and they submitted their information, letting future students know, like, yes, I think that would be nice or something I'd like to do. So potentially, if you're feeling a little bit nervous about reaching out to alumni, maybe that's a good place to start and start identifying alumni by whether or not they're available to mentorship. However, with that being said, if there is someone you would really love to try to connect with and they don't have this designation, that's okay too. You absolutely can reach out and connect with them. So let's say you find someone you want to connect with via MyPenn. You're going to click into that name. That's going to have all sorts of information about campus organizations, college house, any addresses they choose to provide, as well as email addresses. They'll typically have a preferred email and maybe a secondary email that's college specific, or something like that. I always say when you're thinking about which email address to use the preferred email. If you're not comfortable with reaching out via email directly, that's okay. You can still use MyPenn to identify the Penn alumni you want to connect with, and then maybe you search them on LinkedIn and send that outreach message that way. Sometimes more people are apt to check LinkedIn more regularly than maybe to see an email from Penn come through their email. But both options are viable and something definitely to consider. So a lot of the next step of this process is, okay, Megan, you've told me where I can go to identify alumni I want to connect with, how I can start maybe thinking about my Penn or home community as a networking starting point. But what am I supposed to say with these outreach emails? You know, how do I get these people to respond to me? What do I include? And we have all of this information actually on our website. We have a whole PDF document on there about questions to ask by category, some sample templates of what you can say in your email and how to reach out. But I think the most important part here about the outreach part is that you have done your research on that person and you are genuinely interested in what they've done, genuinely interested in the industry they're in. And it's really important you utilize the guides like the ones we have access to in our Penn Career Services website, that will help you come prepared with meaningful questions to make the most of that conversation and make sure you're not wasting anyone's time. Alumni are often happy to help out undergrads. They used to be you once as well. But you also want to make sure you're being cognizant of that they are busy people and they're taking time out of their day to talk to you. So let's make a meaningful conversation. Let's make it worth both your time. And then additionally, if you send that authentic email that shows you've done research and has a clear what or why you want to meet, that's going to increase your chances of that alumni getting back to you, or even a non-Penn contact through a company. And all of this is on our website linked below, and there is a resource guide that has been mentioned in the chat.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joseph Barber. I'm the Director of Graduate Career Initiatives here at Penn's Career Services. I oversee the two graduate teams. Today, I'm going to be talking about interviewing. So a lot of what you've been doing thus far is exploring your options, connecting with people, learning more about those opportunities, learning about the fields, putting that information in your resume to make your own narrative. And then you're getting to a point where you're getting interviews and then having to sort of talk through your experience in different ways. There are lots of different types of interview scenarios, different types of formats for interviews. But at the heart, the things I'm going to talk about today are the questions that you are always likely to get, no matter what the interview is or what you're interviewing for, and then focus a little bit on the behavioral-based interviewing approach, which is common in a wide range of interviewing scenarios and is a great thing to sort of practice coming up with good stories to tell. But first, in terms of a general interview, there are sort of 5 questions that I think you should be very ready for in any interview, whether it's a first round interview or an in-person interview or whatever that looks like. The tell me about yourself question, making sure that you have a nice narrative and a theme that you're able to sort of identify experiences from your past that will map onto the types of knowledge, experience, and skills that they're looking for. So that all gets interwoven within the sort of the tell me about yourself question. The what do you know about us? Obviously, it's something that you should have done your homework ahead of time, but that's some of where your networking comes from. Having talked to people who work in organizations that you're applying to, you can then say, sure, I know lots about you. I had a recent conversation with an alum who works at your organization, and I know this. That's going to be a very proactive and a helpful step to take. Why do you want this job is sort of fundamental to any job interview that you're going on to, or even an internship interview, right? So you have to have a good answer to that. I typically recommend a 2-part answer. the what you bring to the role and what you gain from the role. And you should always prioritize the what you bring to the role over what you gain, because that's what they're most interested in, right? If it's the first interview that they're having, it doesn't matter how excited you are, they need to know that you can do the job first. So starting off with your answer with a question, with a response like, given the job description, I know you're looking for someone who can do X, Y, and Z. Here's how I can do X, Y, and Z, and then illustrating those skills or knowledge areas in action. And then saying, but also, I'm really interested in working in the small startup environment, or nonprofits are where I want to be because of this. Whatever narratives you have about that, the nature of that role, that's what you should integrate there. What do you bring to this role is a cluster of questions, not a single question. It might be, what are your strengths? What is your greatest strength? What value can you bring? What are you going to contribute? But this is a question, obviously, that you really want to be asked, because this is you saying, look, this is how great I am. This is what I can do to this role to make sure that, I add value. So you should be ready to talk about what your strengths are. You should be ready to illustrate those strengths in action, and you should be ready to connect those strengths back to the job itself so that people can really see those. And then, do you have any questions for us? Is a question that you'll typically always be asked, and the answer always has to be yes, right? Even if they've told you and answered all the questions that you thought you needed to ask, you always say, yes, I do, and then you try to ask smart questions, because there are so many questions that you can ask about the teams you'll be working on, about the projects, about the priorities that they have, about professional development opportunities as an employee, right? Things that show that you're interested in the role and the organization. Every time that someone says, do you have any questions? You're like, nope, no, I think I'm all good. It's a real sort of demotivator for the interviewer or the interviewing committee when you say that. The other types of questions then that are common in interviews are these behavioral-based questions. Give me an example of a time when you demonstrated X: leadership, collaboration, communication skills, problem solving. Pretty much any skill that is part of the job that you're applying to, they can ask you about. Any competency, any sort of cluster of skills: communication, problem solving, collaboration, teamwork. These are the traditional transferable skills. They're likely to ask you questions about these in an interview. And when they say, give me an example of, or can you, tell me about a time when, they are looking for, real world examples that you can pull from your own experience and walk them through to illustrate these skills in action. What they're not looking for really is a hypothetical, right? They might say, give me an example of a time when you've demonstrated good leadership, behavior. They don't want you to say, well, if I were in a leadership role, this is how I would approach it. Because to a certain extent, that is a hypothetical, it's a made up sort of scenario. They want you to sort of draw from your past experience and highlight those times where you have demonstrated leadership behavior. And you don't have to have been a leader in this example to show leadership experience, right? There are elements of leadership that occur in everything that you do, whether it's a team or managing a project or anything like that. So here are just some examples of the types of behavioral-based questions that are common. Again, they're going to be specific to the roles that you're applying to. And we have about a sort of a 12-page document, or 8 to 12-page document that lists different types of questions. It's basically the same types of questions, but phrased in different ways. But it's good just to flick through and just to get a sense of the types of questions that can be asked. It's not good to try to come up with answers to every single one of these questions, because that's not going to be a good use of your time. And I'll tell you how you can approach preparation for these questions in just a second. So fundamentally, when you're in an interview scenario and someone says, give me an example of a time when you demonstrated effective collaboration, you have about a 2-minute window of time, more or less, to illustrate this skill in action and make sure that you're highlighting sort of the value that this skill gives you, that you bring to the role that you're applying to. The best way to structure your answer is to sort of make sure that you have a nice framework into which your answer fits, not a meandering monologue where you're not quite sure what you're saying, but a nice structure. And the STAR format is one of those structures. STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result, right? And this basically is a story arc that answers, that gives you the example, but ensures that the listener has all the information that they need to understand the context, shows you what you did, and then the outcome that's associated with that. Now, when I talk about the STAR format, I don't like the word task as much, because tasks feels like it's something that you have to do. Someone set you a task. The term that I like better is the sort of the challenge, because a challenge is something that you can overcome, and that's where your action comes into play. You're overcoming the challenge. But then it becomes like the SCAR format, and the SCAR format sounds less aspirational and optimistic than the STAR format. But ultimately, this is how I would break down that STAR format in terms of how you would answer these questions. When the situation answers all the basic questions, rather than saying, well, I was working on a project, right, which is oftentimes how people start. It gives some context. 2 months ago, I was part of a 3-person team working on a project to identify X and Y, and then everyone has the information that they need to sort of understand. The task is the challenge, is the thing that needs to be overcome. It's the drama of the story, right? So this is where you say, this project was hard because, or this was really difficult because we didn't have the data, right? And you're setting up the tension in the story to get people excited by, what you're going to say next. The action is where you say, and so what I did was this, right? And that action should be connected to the question itself. They ask about communication. The action should be primarily about communication. If the question was about collaboration, the action should be primarily about that. But obviously there are different skills that fall into that. And then the result is also really important because that demonstrates how effective your skills are, because then you can point to what happened. It all worked out really well because we got this paper published, or we developed a new idea that was then used by the rest of the team, or whatever that looks like. The result doesn't have to be earth-shaking. You're not going to be curing cancer. It can be very specific to the task or the challenge that you faced, but you need to make sure that you're wrapping up the story with that result itself. There are 2 elements that I might add to this if you want to sort of go a deeper dive into the STAR format, the STAR format. One is sort of the emotional resonance of the experience. So having gone through your story, you might take a step back and say, sort of a mental step back and say, what I enjoyed most about this experience was, or it was really exciting to work as part of this team, or I learned a lot from this experience, including this, right? So you're giving the interviewers a little peek inside your mind and how you work and what you do. That's the sort of the emotional resonance. And then the relevance is where you say, and actually, this example is a really good fit to the role that I'm applying for, interviewing for, because it's very similar in these ways. So you might be able to tie in the example directly to the role that you're applying to, just to make sure that they see that relevance there. So again, this is sort of the way to structure some of these answers so that you're very focused on making sure that the answer is brief enough to fit in that sort of 2-minute window, concise enough, focused enough, and relevant to your interviewer. So again, these are just some of the examples of what the types of things that you might say as you're wrapping up those star stories. Last thing I'm going to touch on is the fact that sometimes you get questions that are positive. Give me an example of a time where you worked on a team that worked really well together. And sometimes you get a negative leaning question. Give me an example of a time where you worked as part of a team, but it didn't go well. Give me an example of a time where you didn't communicate effectively. So you have to be ready for these negative ones too. My suggestions for this is to go back in time as much as possible. So you might say, when I first started my time at Penn, when I first started this course, this thing happened, right? It didn't go to plan. And then you tell us sort of a star story that is sort of not a successful story, but you wrap that star story up by talking about what you learned. And you say, but I learned a lot from that. And here's what I learned. Here's what I took away from that experience. It didn't work out well. I wasn't happy with it, but here's what I learned about that. And then you end your answer by telling a story that demonstrates how you took what you learned and how you applied that to the next project that you worked on. But in a recent project, I use this knowledge, and this is how I approach the same sort of challenge, right? So it's 2 star stories, one that didn't go well, and then it shows what you learned. And then you wrap up by giving a star story that is you using what you learned to be effective. So you end on a positive note from the interviewer's perspective.